Thank you. It's always an honor to serve as the water boy for Paul Thomas in BC. No, I'll do it. My comments are going to be a little different in that I'm sort of focused more on processes, on exits from leadership. It's based in part on research I'm doing with one of my colleagues, in which we've looked at sort of 180 leaders who've been chosen in the Canadian provinces since 1980. The tenure, how they were chosen, how long they lasted, etc. And one of the things that I would notice is that change has become really more dramatic in terms of leadership politics in Canada. If you count up the number of parties represented in provincial legislatures today, you'll reach 30. If you go back and look at the most recent elections held in the provinces, you find that 19 of those parties have changed their leader since the last election. That's a phenomenal level of political change. In 4 provinces, we're actually seeing each party in the legislature having either held or holding a leadership election. Alberta, Manitoba, Prince Edward Island, and obviously with the elephant in the room, Manitoba, here with the most fascinating of them. You go back a year ago into January 2014, and a lot of the discussion in political science and leadership was on the emerging and very encouraging percentage of women who were serving as provincial premiers. We had women sitting in the premier's office in 5 provinces, including the 4 largest ones. Now it's down to 2, without elections intervening in some of those cases. A woman was serving as the leader of the second party in 3 provinces, and that's now down to 0. So there's been lots of change. Partly the change is driven by these approval ratings. I mean, parties are focused on making sure that they win the next election, and when the approval ratings start to fall, the security and tenure of the leaders becomes a bit more problematic. You look at the leaders at the bottom, and you'll see that Mr. Selinger's numbers have really fallen off the table. He's at 17%. I mean, almost half again as low as the next lowest premier. But the leaders whose approval ratings have fallen well below what their party received in the last provincial election start to have the people in their party room or their caucus think about how that's going to affect their job security in the next election, and their loyalty is challenged by those kinds of thoughts. This, by the way, is just a fairly dramatic depiction of what's happened with Mr. Selinger's leadership in approval ratings in the last few years. Just to go back in terms of thinking about what's changing and why parties are interested in changing leaders, in 5 provinces in the last elections, we had really what was a successful transition of leadership within a governing party. In Manitoba, British Columbia, Alberta, Newfoundland, and Ontario, the party was able to change the leader and retain power, which is obviously what they're aimed at. And if you look even more closely at the parties that were not able to retain power, the PQ, the New Brunswick Conservatives, and the Nova Scotia Democrats, they all went in with the old leader, and they lost. And people pay attention to that. There are 2 people who managed to get re-elected: Joe Gibbs, who's now gone, and of course Brad Wall, who, for reasons that I don't fully understand, is by far the most popular premier in the country. You get a lot of first-time winners too. 7 of the people who were elected were winning on their first time. Stephen McNeil managed to get lucky the second time around. So there's a lot of newness in terms of political success. People in the post-80 world don't get a lot of tries at becoming leader or becoming premier or prime minister. The number who took 2 elections to become premier or prime ministers is relatively modest at 12. 3 elections to become premier, Bob Ray and Darrell Dexter, 4 elections to become premier, Gary Dewar. I think basically because of the party surviving in '88, they bought him a lot of time. The ability to overcome expectations is critical there. You mentioned about people leaving, and I've been sort of interested in what goes on in Australia. Australia has, the Australian parties basically have an ability for the caucus to overthrow the leader with very little notice. But if you look at what's happened when the governing party has changed leaders in Australia, it hasn't been markedly successful. Of the 15 cases since 1980 where the governing party has changed a leader, in only 2 cases they actually win a majority government in the next election. In Canada, it's a bit different. I mean, we don't have the formal caucus votes to get rid of leaders. In some ways, that reduces a bit of the security of tenure of leaders. You look at people like Dunyerdale and Redford, or even Olive Crane in PEI, they're going with just a fairly modest degree of caucus dissatisfaction. A few people express dissatisfaction and it starts snowballing. In the Australian case, you almost don't get the dissatisfaction until there's a critical mass. So it's a rather different process. But what's also the case in Canada is that the changes in governing parties' leadership are usually marked by failure if there's a resignation under pressure. And looked at sort of, I found 12 cases in the same period in Australia. It looks initially like it's more successful in Canada, but that's because most of them are in Alberta, and you just don't lose in Alberta if you're the governing party, at least not for generations. In most of the other cases, you change your leader under pressure, you lose the next election. And as I said, that's true not just in Canada, but in Australia. This is a brief look that you can't see very well on this slide, but it's the major party leadership exits from 1980 to 2014. So what were the circumstances in which the party changed the leader? It shows up beautifully on my computer. Basically, sort of the major party leadership exits since 1980, there were 99 of them. Leaders resigned or premiers resigned under pressure, 13. Premiers resigned on their own terms, 14. Premiers resigned following election loss, 28. So that's the most common path from power, is the electorate retiring the leader. Opposition leaders go after one loss, 29. I was actually quite surprised by that. You don't get a lot of tries to become premier in this context. Opposition leaders go after 2 losses, 9, 3 losses, 1. So again, relatively short tenures. The other thing I wanted to draw your attention to are sort of the differences in the way leaders are chosen in the provinces. And we have a lot of talk now about the primary system for choosing leaders, but conventions remain more popular at the provincial level. 9 of the 29 parties that have chosen leaders recently have used conventions. 8 of them use a kind of traditional convention system, sort of like the NDP is using here, but the NDP's convention system is different from that used by Liberals and Conservatives when they hold conventions. There's one convention where the delegate selection is held at a party, is held prior. The people who are elected as delegates are bound to vote in a particular way on the first ballot at the convention. After that, they can vote whoever they want. That's the system that put Kathleen Wynne in office in Ontario. There's also a system within the sort of primaries, a very wide degree of difference. Some parties weight votes by the members. So it's not just one member, one vote. It's an equal weighting of votes per constituency, no matter how many members vote. You could actually, in this system, have a situation when the winner might receive fewer votes than the person who lost, if in much the same way the single member plurality system operates. A single site vote of all party members, that really works only in the Maritimes, where you can easily drive into a single site for a vote. Vote of party members by mail, internet, phone, or on-site. That's the most common way now that parties choose their leaders in Canada. The Manitoba Conservatives have that system, and they're not acclaiming their leaders at any rate. Electoral college, in which there's members get to vote directly, but there's a certain percentage of votes set aside for affiliated unions. That's used by the New Democrats in Alberta and Ontario, but nowhere else. And then the vote of party members in person at polling stations used to be the Alberta model, now it's limited to the New Brunswick Conservatives. A couple of things I wanted to say about the Manitoba New Democratic Convention, because it's very much a New Democratic convention, not the way that Liberal and Conservative conventions have operated in the past, because there's no equal weighting of constituencies. Your entitlement, your delegate entitlement, is based largely on the number of members you have in the riding. So, for instance, I saw there was about, I think, 16 the constituencies that had 10 or fewer delegates, which meant they had less than 100 members. A couple of constituencies have over 100 delegates, so they have huge constituencies. If there were an all-member vote, those areas would have really disproportionate weight in the system. The one thing I did want to mention in particular about the New Democratic system here in Manitoba is the way in which affiliated organizations work. The entitlement for the convention that's coming up, what is it, next weekend, I think, is for about 691 delegates from affiliated unions. But in practice, in order for that to work, you have to have a person who's a member of the appropriate local, who's also a member of the NDP. And if you can't find enough people who meet those requirements, the unions will not get their full entitlement. So it's quite possible that there won't be 691, or roughly that, delegates. And obviously, the way these rules unfold advantage some candidates more than others. Just to close, I thought there's some interesting ways in which Manitoba kind of stands out in this process. First of all, I think Gary Stewart is an intriguing case. The number of tries to win an election, and by the way, he's the only person in the 180 leaders in our data set who was elected leader of a party in government, failed to win the government, and then actually got elected premier later, which is a fairly impressive achievement. It's also interesting that the New Democrats here in Manitoba have chosen to use a convention. They're the only Western New Democratic Party that uses a convention, and they're the only major New Democratic Party that uses a convention. And it's interesting to see this challenge taking place in a governing party. And I thought that the New Democrats were traditionally marked by more loyalty within the party. The Tory syndrome was something that was attributed to the Conservatives and perhaps sometimes to the Liberals, but it's rarely applied to the New Democrats. So this is an interesting change. It suggests that one of the traditional things that New Democrats have said across the country is that elections are not, or politics is not just about winning an election. It's looking more like it's about winning an election when you make these kinds of leadership changes. And maybe it's because the New Democrats here in Manitoba, and I'm an outside observer, so I may be getting this wrong, but it looks like they've adopted a kind of third way strategy, even though Mr. Dewar rejects that term implicitly. But when you do adopt that, maybe it changes the nature of the party a bit. The last thing I wanted to mention is a bit, again, to include about gender in leadership, is that within Manitoba, the only party that's elected a woman to this point has been the Liberal Party. So that may be another element of change we see coming in Manitoba. Thank you.